What's up guys, CJ from Team Millennium Ninja here, and today is a special day. I have finally watched every Lupin the Third series. Well, mostly, but we'll get around to that eventually. Today though, I'm going to be diving into the first of the modern Lupin series, Lupin the Third Part 4, The Italian Adventure. That's right, pack your bags, do this with your hands, and let's head to Italy to catch up with our favorite master thief. Arrivederci. That's Italian, right? So I had never watched part 4 before doing so in order to make this video, and I don't really know why. I mean, I certainly knew about it when it was coming out, but I don't know what it was. Maybe something to do with the rumors that its production would be different than before, or maybe I had heard some less than positive reviews about it after it had concluded. But for one reason or another, I had never given this series a fair shot. So was I right to avoid it, or was I missing out? Was the unique manner of production something that soured the whole project, or something that just makes it more interesting in retrospect? Was it just not even good to begin with? Well, to find out, let's start by taking a look at its production. Part 4 is the first proper part of Lupin since Part 3 in 1985, with it airing in 2015, 3 decades later. And it's also the first Lupin series to feature Lupin in the leading role since then as well, with the only series in between being The Woman Called Fujiko Mine, which I covered in my last Lupin video, so make sure to check that out if you're interested in hearing more about that series. And also make sure to subscribe while you're at it, because why not? And Woman Called aired in 2012 to much success, most likely prompting this revival of Lupin in 2015. And I said earlier that the series' production was unique, and I didn't just mean unique to Lupin, but unique to anime as a whole. As normally your typical anime gets produced and aired in Japan before being shipped internationally, even with the simulcast and simuldub trends that have been popular in recent years, mostly mitigating that. But Part 4 actually aired in Italy before Japan, with the Japanese version being the last to be finished, and having the international version that would air in the US last being the first to be made, with the Italian version being finished in between those two, and the Japanese taking the extra time to correct some of the animation before broadcast, at least according to what the Lupin the Third wiki says, as I couldn't find another source to verify it. But for the most part, it checks out, with the international releases being split between the English and Italian versions and the Japanese version, as having them all together would cause the subtitles to go out of sync with the Japanese version due to the corrected animation. But that wasn't the only difference between versions. No, this time around, I actually get a reason to bring up the soundtrack. So basically the soundtrack differs between each version of the show, with the Japanese release being helmed by the one and only Yuji Ono, with Ono doing a new version of the classic opening theme for the series, something that would become a trend in subsequent parts as well, and the ending theme being performed by Sayuri Ishikawa, both complete with their own unique opening and ending animations, none of which would be carried over with the international releases, with the Italian version score being done by a jazz group called Papik, and their opening being done by Italian rapper Moreno, using edited clips from the show as the opening animation, something that would be shared between the English and Italian versions. Though, and I can't verify this once again due to lack of sources, but allegedly there was a petition created by fans to prevent the studio from airing the Italian opening, which is kind of hilarious and a little bit understandable, as while I don't think the song is bad by any means, I do think that it doesn't really fit Lupin, which is probably why they didn't use it in the English release, instead having the openings and endings being done by Papik for the first half, and switching in the second half to a more poppy opening by the jazz singer Meg, and a more R&B style ending by the group Sweep, which kind of slaps, not gonna lie, and having the main series score still being done by Papik, which means that the Yuji Ono score is only available in the Japanese version, which is kind of a shame if you don't want to watch that version, but Papik still does a good job, so it's not like it's horrible or anything. And now that we've gotten through that maze of a soundtrack, I think it's fair to say that the unique production of the series had little to no bearing on the overall quality, aside from maybe some less than satisfactory animation in the non-Japanese versions. So how does the story hold up, and what were the creators behind it trying to accomplish with it? Well, they at least started off on the right foot by appointing Kazuhide Tominaga as the series director, who, if you're not familiar, is a veteran of the franchise, having worked on many Lupin projects over the years, most notably probably being as a key animator on Castle of Cagliostro, more specifically on the car chase scene. And it certainly shows, since some of the best animated sequences in this series are the chases, car or otherwise. But Tominaga came into the project with a mission. He wanted to bridge the generational gap between fans, from the people that grew up with Part 1 to the younger fans of today, saying that he wanted to make a Lupin that was realistic yet sprinkled with fantastical elements, one in which conflicting elements coexist, hard-boiled yet comical, cool yet tongue-in-cheek, which is a pretty daunting task for anyone. And add on top of that, that Part 4 would be the first mainline Lupin series to incorporate an overarching plot, something that had only been done before in the movies and The Woman Called Fujiko Mine. We see that Tominaga and the crew were treading very new, very uncertain grounds, but they were confident in this new direction for Lupin, and to signify it, they gave him a brand new jacket color, taking us into the blue jacket era of Lupin. But would they be able to pull off this bold new direction? Well, let's find out. But before we begin, I didn't want to come into this alone, so to do this series justice, I enlisted a big Part 4 fan to come and help me out.
Hello YouTube, Morkez Marihser here. I don't have a good camera, but I'm a big fan of Lupin as well, and like CJ said, I have seen Part 4. On my first viewing, it was my favorite show of the bunch, and I'm curious to see if that remains the case with a more critical eye this time. So, without further ado, pardon my Italian, let's dive into some Blue Jacket. After all this time, you and the gang have come back to do Part 4. So, what was it like? Well, it was certainly exciting for me, though it had been quite some time since we did things the way we used to, but once we got back together, it felt like no time had passed at all. Really? Just like that? Well, I suppose it took a bit. After Part 3, things had kind of gone quiet. Fujiko and Jigen went off to do their own thing, Goemon kind of dropped off the face of the planet for a while, and we had been going non-stop for a long time, so I was fine with taking a break. Then in about 2011-2012, someone approached us about coming back together, though we weren't quite able to get Fujiko to sign off on another project so easily. She was saying that she was too big for a bit part like she used to have.
Well, someone of my talent deserves top billing, and if they couldn't even manage that, it wasn't worth my time.
After the end of Part 3, Fujiko was able to transition from her small role into a very successful solo career, becoming a big breakout star.
Apparently, the decision ultimately came down to Lupin, and when he heard what I had in mind, he was all for it.
They told me Fujiko wanted to be on top, and that's something I could never refuse.
Top billing? More like top list billing with how that show went.
Someone should tell Jigen he doesn't know what avant-garde filmmaking is. Sure, it went a little overboard, but that's a sacrifice for art.
Hey, I didn't say I was complaining.
And don't even get me started on that guy who played Zenigata. Method acting is one thing, but that man needs some psychiatry.
I told you before, I'm Inspector Zenigata of Interpol. I'll be the one asking questions here.
So, what was it like making Part 4?
My experience? Well, I've been chasing Lupin for years now, when I caught word that he was going to do this project. So I followed him to the set, but the guy who they had playing Zenigata before quit, so they asked me if I wouldn't mind, and since I knew Lupin wasn't going anywhere, I figured, what the heck?
Yeah, never would have pegged Pops as a thespian, but I was surprised. He really let down his hair this time.
What was it like coming back for Part 4 after Woman Called?
Job's a job, simple as that. The money was right, so I decided to come back. After Part 3, Jigen also tried to strike out on his own, making his debut in the movie Jigen, which released to moderate commercial and critical success. Unfortunately for him, however, the success wouldn't last very long, and soon the critics would call him a washed-up has-been. What was that?
Well, Woman Called went pretty well, and once we all got back together, it kind of felt like the old days again. And when it was over, the question of coming back for a new part came up, and I think it just felt natural for us to do it at the time.
Yeah, Part 4 went pretty smoothly. I don't think Fujiko was the biggest fan of Rebecca coming in, though. Seemed like she was afraid of the new girl muscling in on her territory.
Oh, please. I have no idea what you mean.
Rebecca Rossellini could not be reached for comment, as she's too busy filming Venice of the Dead 2, Carnage in the Carnal Canals and Catacombs, starring Justin Person.
Disgust rises from deep within me.
That series should have been a one and done.
The cast was later asked about their work with the actor who played the role of Leonardo da Vinci, who was left uncredited in the final release.
Leo,
huh?
Yeah, Leo. He was played by some guy who took the role way too seriously.
Calling him Method is like calling Jigen grumpy. The guy was always in Da Vinci mode, and you couldn't pay him to stop. Believe me, the producers tried.
He never took off his prosthetic beard, never broke his accent, and he tried to invent like 18 flying machines. None of them freaking worked. One of them crushed my freaking car, and another one hit me right in the freaking kisser.
On the bright side, it made that episode with the dentist much more realistic.
Well, the man painted me several times. It might have been flattering if he could paint as well as he acted.
We had to put out several paintings she set on fire.
It's not my fault. They're not that big.
Well...
Disgust rises from deep within me.
Who asked you?
Come on, Goemon. You gotta say more than that. I mean, you were freaking party animal on set.
You're clearly a man of few words here. Is there any brief description you could give?
10 words.
Pardon?
I said 10 words.
Well, what are they?
You can find them in this video on Morkez Marihser's channel. Link in the description.
How much are they paying you?
Not the plugging again!
Ugh, you boys deal with this one. I'm heading back to my trailer.
Wait! We'll just have to save this in post. Cut and print, people. The film's not here. What? Oh, no.
Lupin!
And that's a wrap. Catch me later, Pops.
Lupin the Third Part 4 starts off with one of the very rare continuital continuations in Lupin, where Part 4 actually picks up right where Part 3 left off, with Lupin getting married.
Wait a minute. That's not a dolphin, it's a woman!
Yeah, all jokes aside, Part 4 once again continues the tradition of being a standalone Lupin series, not actually connecting to any series before or really after, at least so far. But like I said, this series starts off with Zenigata walking in on the damnedest damn thing he's ever seen in his whole damned life.
Lupin's tying the knot, but not with Fujiko. Instead, his bride is a brand new girl introduced in the series, Rebecca Rossellini. She is a genius, billionaire, playgirl, philanthropist, oh wait, that's the wrong script, model, actress, entrepreneur, you name it, she's been it and is stinking rich for it. Seems like a typical target for Lupin, but there's more to her than meets the eyeliner. As it turns out, she's doing the wedding for the same reason he is, to steal the royal crown of Libertas, the most well-guarded treasure in all of San Marino.
With this first episode mainly being used to introduce Rebecca's character, as well as to give us some classic crew shenanigans with the older characters, with the only real contribution to the series from this episode being Rebecca's introduction, which I actually really enjoyed, maybe even a little surprisingly, as going into the series, one thing I took note of was fans' mixed opinions on Rebecca, and with fan opinion being divided, I was worried she might end up being a lackluster character, or just as bratty as she was made out to be initially in the episode. But by the end of the episode, I thought she was really fun and a good foil to Lupin, in a unique way that wasn't necessarily the same as Fujiko, but also similar enough to where I could foresee it causing interesting conflict between those two in the future. But those are just initial impressions, and a lot can change by the end of the series, so we'll just have to see how our character progresses throughout.
For my first impression, I had just binged parts 1 to 3, Woman Called, and a number of movies, so watching this was really interesting. The first episode gave me a little bit of what I loved about prior material. It was a good blend of familiar stuff like Part 2's goofiness and some of the film's intensity, along with new stuff like the central long-term location and a Lupin girl for the whole series. But Rebecca was a lot more than your typical Lupin girl. She was abrasive, yes, but not in a way that didn't make me want to see more of her. And the scene with the two jumping off the tower had me sucked in right then and there. Also, to comment briefly on the voice acting, the Part 2 dub cast returns in full with the exception of Dan Lorge, who retired to teach acting. Zenigata is now played by Doug Erholz, who took a little getting used to but earned his stripes rather quickly. But yeah, the first episode had me hooked to see where the plot would go with this setting and its cast.
Sadly though, the plot doesn't continue directly into the next episode, as while despite the series having an overarching narrative like I mentioned before, quite a few of the episodes in this part are also standalone episodes with either very little or nothing to do with the plot, similar once again to the Woman Called Fujiko Mine, and a formula the franchise would stick to moving forward as well.
This has its pros and cons. The strength of this format is that the writers aren't tied down to make every single thing tie into the greater narrative, and they can let individual concepts flourish. The downside is that it gives you the impression that it will all be more consistently interconnected. Rebecca here, a divorce paper there, something we'll get into in the second half. They do show up in the one-offs, but they're background dressing. I'm glad they're here, but they they don't always add much to the given episodes.
So for the most part, unless these standalone episodes are particularly interesting, I'm mostly just going to skim over them. Starting with the second episode, which is about a soccer player who hires Lupin to steal some documents from a mob boss. Documents that would prove he's doping, though it turns out he's only been taking medicine for his eye disease to keep playing soccer. It's an alright episode, nothing too memorable though.
But it does give us an introduction to Nyx, the anti-hero of the series, presented as hired muscle at first and later revealed to be a lot more, although we won't really know it until the following episode.
Where he goes up against Lupin, who's in the midst of a heist that would probably take up a majority of the episode in one of the older series, trying to steal Marie Antoinette's necklace. But the episode mostly focuses on setting up Nyx as a member of MI6, the British secret intelligence agency, and showing his cat and mouse game with Lupin, with him capturing Jigen and going after Lupin in an attempt to stop him from stealing the necklace, just barely being foiled by Lupin's pre-planning using Rebecca as a decoy. And in this episode, Nyx is made out to be a real threat, showing off some superhuman abilities like being able to detect people's movements through sonar, more of which will be fleshed out and expanded upon later. But I think here is a good place to mention Part 4's TV special, The Italian Game.
If you look up The Italian Game, you might think it's a Part 4 related movie, which is not entirely accurate. It's a reworking that reuses footage from episodes 1, 3, and the second OVA, along with some new material. In short, a descendant of Count
Cagliostro.
No relation.
challenges Lupin to find his great-grandfather's treasure, involving the MacGuffins from those episodes.
And it's an interesting experiment in the Lupin filmography, using standalone episodes with new animation to tell a diverging story to the series. Unfortunately though, aside from the novelty of it, I wouldn't say it's necessarily worth revisiting, as the story it tells is kind of lackluster in comparison to the story of Part 4 in my opinion.
The custom intro does reference the manga though, and not by making Lupin a psychopath. So that's pretty neat.
The intro is pretty bitchin'. But let's dive back into the main series proper with episode 4, which isn't a plot episode, but is the obligatory Jigen episode, where he once again faces his arch nemesis, the Toothache.
And if you thought the scene at the dentist from Tokyo Crisis was crazy, you would be right.
He also gets caught up in a gang war between a hospital and a gang of thugs that hoard all the guns in the area for themselves, ending with Jigen taking them out in badass Jigen fashion as always. And this was a pretty good Jigen episode, with a nice setup calling back to his classic Toothache. Unfortunately, the next episode is not a pretty good Jigen episode, mostly because it's a Fujiko episode, but even still I wasn't a big fan. It involves her pretending to date this young magician guy who was the only successor of an older magician guy's secrets, but has been reluctant to use them due to lack of confidence in himself, until our wholesome old Fujiko swoops in to make him believe in himself and make off with the cash for marketing his skills or whatever. But the plot mostly follows the POV of Lupin trying to figure this all out, and personally it wasn't that interesting of a story to me. But if you like magic, I might recommend giving this episode a watch. Or if you want to see a similar concept, except that the twist is there is no twist, check out Part 3's episode 36, which this episode kind of reminds me of, except that episode goes way more bonkers with the whole Civil War plot. And after that, we get the ever so rare Zenigata episode.
About freaking time.
And it's actually a good one, which is even rarer, with Zenigata appointing himself to protect the possibly non-existent treasure of a freshly widowed lady, where we follow mostly from the POV of Zenigata as the episode goes through some interesting twists and turns, where Pops really gets to strut his stuff, and I'm always a sucker for that. Plus, this episode kind of reminds me of episode 69 of Part 2, and I really appreciate this feeling of maybe not necessarily calling back to classic episodes, but evoking similar feelings and ideas, making the series feel much less jarring as Lupin slips into the modern era.
It's odd though. There were a lot of opportunities to use Rebecca in these episodes, especially here. For the series' breakout character, they really don't use her to her full potential in most of the one-offs. Maybe that's why her reception was mixed at first.
I agree, and thankfully we do get to see some more of her in the next episode.
Which is a Goemon episode, right? He's the only one left.
Nope, in this episode we get to learn a little bit more about Nyx, meeting his family and specifically his daughter, who takes a big role in this episode.
Ladies and gentlemen, Spy X Lupin.
With his daughter being a big fan of Rebecca, who gets kidnapped after meeting her and trying to return her handbag, with Lupin and Jigen getting mixed up in things when they unknowingly take the car Nyx's daughter is tied up in, ultimately ending up in another fight with Nyx, and this time we get to see some more of Nyx's abilities, with him showing off some kind of berserker state, with all kinds of veins popping out in his face when he gets really worked up.
A Spyo-Ken, if you will. Hey, CJ can't hog all the bad jokes.
Something which also might cause him to lose control of himself, hinted at by MI6 showing the countermeasures they had prepared for if that did happen. Luckily for everybody involved though, that doesn't happen, as Lupin and Rebecca reveal they had no intention of doing anything to his daughter and sent her home safely. And it was cool to see a little bit more character from Nyx, with him getting all worked up over his daughter, since he came off as so robotic the last time that we saw him, as well as the Chekhov's gun of his berserk state being a great way to set it up now for a payoff later. And this episode is also the first to hint at the overarching plot, name dropping the Dream of Italy, an ambiguous phrase for now, but something we'll learn about more later.
But first, take a trip to Hotel Scooby-Doo with Lupin and Jigen dealing with a ghost! What makes you think I'm kidding?
Yep, that's right. In this episode, Lupin and Jigen stay in a fake haunted hotel that's actually haunted, showing off a little bit of the fantastical elements Tominaga talked about incorporating into the series.
Is this episode so stupid it's charming, or does it go all the way back to stupid? Yes.
Now it's time for the Goemon episode. Though, to be fair, pretty much any episode with Goemon doing anything would probably be considered the Goemon episode, since he hasn't really contributed since episode 2.
You know how Zenigata got underutilized in part 6? Well, for part 4, Goemon got the pink end of the blade. No, I have no idea why he's wearing pink either.
And in the episode, Goemon teams up with an old assassin acquaintance when he thinks that they are being hunted by a former target. Though she betrays Goemon in the end, only for him to forgive her and help her remove a bomb from her chest, samurai style. Samurai.
That's a lot of consecutive filler of varying quality, to say the least. But thankfully, we're back to the plot.
Hell yeah, the plot everyone cares about. Fujiko and Rebecca making a love triangle over Lupin because of some good-ass wine.
It's a lot better than it sounds.
Action, excitement, drinking wine.
Don't knock it till you try it. This episode is a straight up rom-com, but it does stand out to me. Not only are you expecting things to go off the wall because, hey, it's Lupin, but it ends up starting a pretty sweet rivalry between Fujiko and Rebecca, and features an accurate reenactment of the Lupin fanbase anytime a new show comes out.
And their little thief-off actually highlights their different methods of achieving the same goal, which is a cool way to show off the differences between the two. Alright, this time plot for real.
I don't believe you.
You've seen the show before!
So now we have a two-parter, The Dream of Italy. Part 1 begins with Rebecca kidnapped by MI6, when her butler Robson, who earns the Alfred Pennyworth Award for badass buttling, comes to Lupin for help. Lupin manages to trick MI6 into escorting Rebecca outside their impregnable fortress, where Nix and Robson have a standoff that makes Nix go Spy-O-Ken times 20. The agency cuts him off, but he's now out to kill Lupin in the second part. We also learn Rebecca had a late ex-boyfriend named Ko. In prior appearances, Rebecca refused to drink any red wine, and it turns out Ko's death was the reason. Ko also had a secret, revealed in part 2, the titular Dream of Italy, a psychedelic mindscape that Lupin enters by reading too hard.
Remember kids, stay in drugs, don't do school. And after Lupin enters the dreamscape, he ends up meeting with Ko.
I mean, it's his consciousness that's been implanted into Lupin's mind because of the book, but semantics.
Who explains to Lupin that he discovered how to do that, and that MI6 is after his research, which Lupin takes Rebecca to find, explaining to her about what he experienced in his dream, telling her that he met Ko and learned why she doesn't drink red wine, something he wouldn't have known beforehand, which makes her believe him. And afterwards they find the research, but with Nix hot on their trail, leading them to burn the research so MI6 doesn't get their hands on it. But with Nix still after them, we get a pretty cool chase that ultimately ends up with Lupin being captured and Zenigata taking him into custody, leading into the next episode where we get Lupin sitting in a prison cell the whole episode.
If that sounds familiar, Part 1, Episode 4.
Which is a setup in order to make a grand escape by the end.
And just like that episode, the escape is incredibly over the top.
Not all filler though, as we get something pretty interesting at the end, where we see a mysterious, naked, bearded man escape from MI6.
So that's where they were hiding Santa Claus.
Damn MI6, trying to steal Christmas again?
At least Lupin takes a holiday in the next one. Or more accurately, a visit to France to steal the Mona Lisa.
But wait, there's 2 Mona Lisas? Well, one's the original, and the other was painted by our bearded friend. What could this mean? Find out later, because first Lupin goes back to school.
This episode, I want to call it a comedy of errors, but it's more like an explosion of pratfalls, literally. It involves science teachers who need a rare diamond to power a bomb so that they can get out of a situation where they owe some thugs money. And yes, the obvious does get pointed out.
They also think they have a chance at killing Lupin the fucking third themselves with a bottle of acid, a mop, and a stand-up bass. And I think one guy had a baseball bat.
I think it was a cello.
Because that would have made it so much more effective.
Boy, does this feel like a return to the screwball comedy of part 3.
Yeah, like all this episode is missing is a Lupin crew road trip and a pervy dog or something like that.
Well, now that you mention it, the next episode has the Lupin gang taking a road trip together to return a dog to Fran Drescher. This one, take it or leave it. At least it has Goemon's classic insistence on eating sushi, and Fujiko, I actually felt sorry for her in this one, and that's not easy to do. So let's leave it at that.
Well, next up we have Board Game Night with Clue, Lupin the 3rd edition. I call Lupin in Interpol HQ with the Walter.
He uses waltzer. He is a groovy guy. The machine cries.
a mastermind, thinks he can kill Lupin by kidnapping the gang and having them turn on each other in a death trap. Lupin is of course wise to this, and the others manage to evade the traps, including Fujiko's patented anti-stabbing technique.
Next episode, turns out Santa Claus was Leonardo da Vinci the whole time. Called it!
You didn't even explain the episode.
Do I really need to? That was the episode. Exposition over dinner. And of all the famous Italian figures to use, they went with Da Vinci. Titanic wasn't even that good.
Well, who'd you expect?
Mario?
I'd go Tifa. Anywho, I have to admit, the first time I saw this, I was legit shocked. On the rewatch though, I noticed that there were several clues and some thick foreshadowing. Still, this is the second best fictional Da Vinci in my eyes. My heart will always go out to John Rhys Davies.
Was that the guy from Assassin's Creed 2?
If I say yes, can we get back to the plot?
Nope, the next episode is another one-off. A cool one-off, but a one-off nonetheless. It involves Nyx trying to recover the Dragon's Tail, a top-secret data disk that lists all the MI6 agents on it. But while doing so, he runs into Lupin, who's trying to steal the Dragon's Tail as well, which ends up in the island they're on being completely overrun by MI6, with Lupin and Nyx making their escape in grand fashion with some help from Jigen and Goemon.
This does bring MI6's involvement to a close, as Da Vinci kills the guy in charge and takes what he needs for the finale, freeing Nyx from his service in the process. We'll get more into that at the end, but we've still got 2 more fillers to go.
Now, for the biggest tonal whiplash between 2 consecutive episodes, probably ever. The first being a rather down-to-earth and personal story of a car and its owners that wraps up with Lupin imparting a final sweet memory to them after taking it on a joyride. And in the next episode,
everyone's back in stereotypical Japan with Lupin and Fujiko on a date and a guy named Akechi Holmes,
yes, that's his real name,
who tries to arrest them, and the whole thing's a setup which leads to a chase involving a fake Zenigata in a tank facing off with a mortar cannon before going off a bridge. You know, Lupin!
You good, buddy?
A 3-minute egg must boil for 3 minutes.
Great, let's get in the home stretch then. The next episode has Rebecca trying to flirt with Lupin by trying to out-thief him, which is really freaking cute.
Which is about what I expected their honeymoon to be like, if she had ever filed the marriage papers, which she never actually did. Well played.
Meanwhile, Lupin's looting banks to try and find a specific dollar in order to win a bet with Jigen on who has to clean up the house, which is a fun little setup to the episode.
This episode basically consists of smaller character moments. Lupin and Jigen have their bet, Robson and Fujiko discuss Rebecca's obsessions, Lupin and Rebecca have a lover's spat, we even get a better idea of how capable Robson actually is, since he's doing his best to let Rebecca chase her dreams.
Yeah, and I like this episode quite a bit, but one thing I wasn't a big fan of was how it made Rebecca out to be basically useless without him, which unfortunately cuts her character into 2 halves, with one being Robson. Not that he's a bad character himself, it's just that in the beginning she's depicted as super capable with Robson helping out. But now it just brings into question just how much of her successes were due to her own merit and not his, which matters to me at least because her ability to stand shoulder to shoulder with Lupin was one of the reasons I liked her in the first place.
I can't say I share that perspective, but I see your point. She still proves herself capable, just never quite equal to Lupin, and there are scenes about whether she feels like she's earned the name Mrs. Lupin because of it. But more on that later, as we have the finale with Da Vinci's Endgame.
But before we get into that, now I think would be a good time to mention the 2 OVAs that aired earlier in the series in Italy and as episodes 25 and 26 internationally. With the first one covering Lupin being duped by Rebecca into starring in a zombie movie that she's directing, which is a pretty fun little episode, though loses most of its merit on the rewatch, with a lot of the initial intrigue coming from the twist of Lupin being fooled, and aside from that, it's basically just another one-off episode.
The second OVA, the one compiled into the Italian game, is a flashback to before the wedding. Lupin's just trying to eat sushi, planning out his scheme, when Rebecca is kidnapped by an obsessed fanboy on a train. Zenigata arrests Lupin in his car, eats his sushi, and helps him rescue her in a hilarious chase sequence that takes up most of the runtime. It's all very reminiscent of the Castle of Cagliostro, obviously per Tomonaga's involvement, and it sets up the first episode pretty well.
But to get us back on track, let's get to the finale, which starts with Da Vinci putting all of Italy to sleep.
He must have shown them Return of Paikal, the monster.
And in everyone's dream, he gives them a test to see if they can contribute something to his new, perfect society. Or else they will effectively die and their bodies will remain under his control.
So essentially the plot of Pokemon X and Y, which takes place in France, Lupin was French, it's all connected!
And so is Da Vinci, to everyone's brains, including the leads, who each get their own individual tests based on their specialties. Jigen surprisingly gets a gunfight, Goemon a sword fight, Fujiko plays some strip poker, Zenigata whoops his ass, Rebecca fails, and Lupin succeeds by apparently having already read the script, I guess.
I file that under Code 71. Screw it, it's Lupin.
They use that code a lot.
In order to save Rebecca, Lupin needs to hook himself up to the big brain machine to plug into Rebecca's mind, which brings us to the final episode, or as I like to call it, Kingdom Hearts Dream Drop Lupin.
And Lupin's had some pretty trippy sci-fi elements before, but now he's outwitting Da Vinci, who is literally painting the world around him and turning Rebecca's memories into a fortress. But throughout these two episodes, we get a pretty good showcase of Rebecca's character progression, leading to a callback to the first episode with both her and Lupin skydiving off a tower.
This is where Lupin returns control back to Rebecca, calling her Mrs. Lupin, and she takes back her memories by creating a whole new world of her own design, forcing Da Vinci out.
Which, of course, ends up in a gaudy room with a disco ball, with Rebecca back to normal, and they return to consciousness and confront Da Vinci, who, as it turns out, is now dying because he was too OP and developed an incurable illness that came out of nowhere.
Or more accurately, he was an unstable clone instead of just being resurrected. A bit cheap, but it does lead to a decent character moment for Lupin himself.
The way I explained it was better. I did really enjoy this ending though. It was fittingly grandiose in scale, in a way other Lupin series that focus more on the episodic style couldn't really attain. And it was a lot of fun, even if it could have been served better by having a little bit more build up leading up to it.
I agree. Oh, and you want to know the craziest thing about this?
Shoot.
So, since Da Vinci copied his mind into the entire population of Italy, about 60 million people, Lupin had to do the same to stop him from taking over their minds. He fails once, the victim becomes Zombie DiCaprio. Meaning for all the possible combinations of worlds Leo could come up with, Lupin's mind had to beat every single one of them simultaneously. That is the most ridiculous, absurd, and nonsensical thing that he has ever done, and I love it.
And of course, since everyone in Italy all just had Lupin in their heads, the media accuses Lupin of causing kids to become violent and bans him from the country. So now he has to leave the country, but not before one last goodbye to Rebecca, and mostly to get his Walter back. Man's gotta make the machine cry. Bang, bang.
We reached our nice guy Lupin quota already.
There is no quota!
Anyway, after everything that happens, there's a sweet moment between Lupin and Rebecca, where Rebecca tears up their unsigned marriage contract and says that one day she'll earn the Mrs. Lupin name. Lupin says he looks forward to it, and the show ends with the gang all catching a train to France for part 5.
Nice man, yeah, he smiles, and he gets angry sometimes, but he's a groovy guy. Yeah, Lupin the Third.
And so that does it for Lupin the Third Part 4, another unique entry into this diverse franchise. And before I go any further, I want to give a big thanks to everybody that helped out with the video. Links to their stuff is going to be down in the description below. And a special thanks from Morkez for joining me here as well.
No problem, CJ. I was happy to...
You're still here?
Yeah, well, I don't have a professional setup.
Oh, well, I guess, thanks for coming on.
No problem. So, is Lupin the Third Part 4 still my favorite of the shows? Yes, but perhaps not by as wide a margin as it used to be. What with missed opportunities here and there for the newer characters to interact with the classic ones. But it was still an effective melding of all the best aspects of past Lupin with some experiments to keep up in the future, which they did, as well as the return of a kick-ass soundtrack. Well, in Japan anyhow. This is Morkez Marihser, signing off.
Yeah, I actually enjoyed the series quite a bit, with the new characters introduced bringing an interesting flavor to the classic Lupin formula, as well as their foray into an overarching narrative, which actually came out pretty well as a good blend of classic and modern Lupin, if albeit a little over the top, feeling more like an expanded version of a Lupin movie than a TV series proper, especially at the end. But Tomonaga really succeeded in his goal of mixing in fantastical and realistic elements into Lupin, creating an overall interesting series that I would like to see get some more love in newer iterations. I mean, I know Rebecca shows up briefly in part 5, but I would like to see some more of her and Robson, as well as Nyx, who to my knowledge hasn't shown up in anything since, which is a bit of a shame since I thought these characters were welcome additions to the series, and I think they could make for some interesting characters to pop up in a movie or a special or hell, even another TV series moving forward. So I hope the creators don't forget about them and maybe we can see these characters again. But other than that, the series was a great first step for Lupin moving into the modern era. A step that would be continued? Does that work? A direction that would be continued moving into Lupin the Third Part 5, which I'll be covering next time. So make sure you're subscribed because you won't want to miss it. And this has been CJ from Team Millennium Ninja, headed back to the village, hidden in the internet.